Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Hyperabyssic Ontology, Part 8, Knowledge and Understanding. Kabbalistic lore describes the human soul through a tripartite division into neshama, ruach, and nefesh. Within the Golden Dawn's use of the Tree of Life, neshama relates to the supernal triad of Sephiroth 1 through 3, ruach encompasses Sephiroth 4 through 8, or Hesed through Hod, and nefesh Sephirah 9 Yesod. In my structuralist reading of the Kabbalah, neshama represents the absent totality of subjectivity that Lacan terms the real. The psyche's incompleteness, in turn, facilitates the speculative projection of reason into creatively unanticipated regions of being. Ruach corresponds broadly to what Freud calls the ego, the domain of self-conscious awareness, and nefesh to the function of Freud's unconscious. Since I treat neshama as a feature of human existential ontology, rather than the soul's point of connection to a supernatural absolute, any full transcendence or final destruction of the psychoanalytic ego is denied to the subject. According to the Book of the Law, death is forbidden, O man, unto thee. Chapter 2, verse 73. All such attempts end in a reinforcement of narcissism through the identification of religious fantasy with reality. Instead, the goal of Kabbalistic theurgy and thelemic magic is therapeutic. Through self-awareness of the illusory virtuality of the self becomes transparent to itself while still continuing to phenomenally manifest. In this spiritualized context, the magician journeys into the depths of the psyche to release the creative drive of the true will. Concurrently, the magician develops coping strategies, such as political activism or other positive social involvements, to constructively and ethically address the ego's inherent disequilibrium with its inconsistent and incomplete environment, in accord with priorities and projects disclosed by the release of the drive. At no point in good magical work should the element of self-critical cognition be absent. Even and especially while in states of trance, the magician should remain responsibly cognizant of their activity in terms of their larger social commitments. The abyss serves to divide neshama from the lower tree, the psychological functions of ruach and nefesh that neshama structurally undergirds. Crowley's treatment of the function of the abyss focuses on a distinction between knowledge, or da'ath, the 11th false sephira at the level of the abyss, and understanding, or bina, corresponding to neshama. These terms are capitalized to indicate that they exemplify the qualities in question. Knowledge with a capital K is some specific thing that one knows, and understanding with a capital U is something concrete that one can understand. These are human activities and not, I am arguing, supernaturally external functions supervening on human consciousness from another world. Specifically, what one comes to both know and understand on the magical path is a spiritual truth about oneself concerning the divinely magical nature and powers of one's own being. This truth is epitomized by the true will, which is the equilibrated resultant of one's knowledge, alchemically dissolved through analysis, and then spiritually recoagulated, so that the whole structure of accumulated experience becomes understood from the perspective of the gnosis of the will, such that it is illuminated with meaning and purpose. The functioning of the lower sephira of the tree culminates in knowledge. Yet, Crowley writes, quote, knowledge itself is of no avail unless it be assimilated and coordinated into understanding, unquote. Understanding is produced through an alchemical refinement of knowledge, and Crowley describes this process as the transformation of the trance or vision of sorrow, that is the culmination and conclusion of knowledge, into the vision of change, which is also the vision of wonder, and the trance of beatitude, that are the intuition of neshama. He writes that, quote, the mind is, with assiduity and enthusiasm, capable of transforming the trance of sorrow itself into the cognate trance attributed to understanding, the trance of wonder, unquote. This is in fulfillment of what is written in the Book of the Law that, quote, existence is pure joy, that all the sorrows are But as shadows, they pass and are done, but there is that which remains. Chapter 2, verse 9. Knowledge is generated by ruach, of which Crowley writes, quote, "This may be translated mind, spirit, or intellect. None of these is satisfactory, the connotation varying with every writer. The ruach is a closely knitted group of 5 moral and intellectual principles, concentrated on their core, Tifereth, the principle of harmony, the human consciousness and will, of which the 4 other Sephiroth are, so to speak, the feelers. And these 5 principles culminate in a 6th, Da'ath, knowledge. But this is not really a principle. It contains in itself the germ of self-contradiction and so of self-destruction. It is a false principle, for as soon as knowledge is analyzed, it breaks up into the irrational dust of the abyss." Unquote. I read this text in an anti-foundationalist sense. Absolute truth cannot be fixed a priori. For example, any proposition can be either true or false, but its actual valuation is formally undetermined by the rules of logic. Reason is ideological and suffused with surplus signification. Yet these are precisely the conditions that the subjective experience of Ruach must navigate. The magician is never released from these conditions, regardless of their level of attainment. Indeed, Crowley's whole point is that the magician cannot appeal directly to the immediate truth of their spiritual experience, which always retains the status of practical and provisional constructs. Even the meaning of the Book of the Law is written and concealed, chapter 375, by Kabbalistic ciphers that subvert the surface appearances of the text narrative, leaving the interpretive horizon of the text open. Crowley writes, quote, "There is no real intellectual perception possible. What we suppose to be such is in fact a series of more or less plausible conventions, based upon the apparent parallelism of experience. There is no final warrant that any 2 persons mean precisely the same thing by sweet or high. Even such conceptions as those of number are perhaps only identical in relation to practical vulgar applications. These and similar considerations lead to certain types of philosophical skepticism." Unquote. The recognition of the necessary relativity of knowledge is the basis for the trance or vision of sorrow, which is exemplified by the first noble truth of Buddhism, that everything is sorrow. Far from trying to avoid this insight, the magician must strive to comprehend its relative truth, for precisely through the understanding of the specific quality of knowledge is it transcended, and the trance of sorrow magically transformed into the trance of wonder. Understanding, Crowley writes, quote, "is the chief quality of neshama, and it is independent of any of the normal modes of motion of the mind. Samadhi, at first onset productive of bewildering ecstasy, ultimates in this understanding. One may say, therefore, that understanding implies a certain samadhic quality of apprehension that assumes a form which it would be absurd to call dualistic. It will be noticed that violation of logic is essential to every true effort to convey the conception." Unquote. The logical grammar that is violated by the formulations of the understanding is the analytical logic of Aristotle's organon, which is based on the laws of identity and of the excluded middle. A equals A because it is presumed that A excludes what is not A. However, there is an alternative dialectical mode of logical reasoning that is able to represent the integral form of the intuitions of neshama, which consist in concepts, quote, "that include in themselves their own contradiction and therefore have no antithesis," unquote. This mode of philosophical reasoning is most notably developed in the modern period in the works of G.W.F. Hegel, but is also anticipated by certain tendencies of thought in ancient times. For example, Plato's Sophist and the Parmenides, Pyrrhic and academic skepticism, and in Buddhist Mahayana philosophy, especially the Madhyamika and the Prajnaparamita traditions. Hegel defines the 3 stages of critical reasoning as the abstract, the dialectical, and the speculative. The abstract, also called the formal, consists in the concepts and categories of thought built up from experience. This is the position of so-called common sense, or of naive realism, and it corresponds to what Crowley designates as knowledge. Hegel writes that, quote, knowledge begins by apprehending existing objects and their specific differences. In the study of nature, for example, we distinguish matters, forces, genera, and the like, and stereotype each in its isolation. Thought is here acting in its analytic category, where its canon is identity, a simple reference of each attribute to itself, unquote. This mode of everyday thinking presumes the rules formalized in Aristotle's logic, in which it is presumed that phenomenal appearances simply and immediately are what they appear to be. However, this presumption does not hold up when subjected to philosophical skepticism, which causes thought to proceed to the stage of the dialectical by showing how ultimately, quote, every abstract proposition taken precisely as it is given naturally veers round into its opposite, unquote. That's quoting Hegel. Whatever position we can posit as being true can, under some other possible analysis, be interpreted as being false. How plausible these interpretations are from the standpoint of common sense is irrelevant to the point that Hegel is making, which is not so much to challenge common sense in its own sphere of everyday operation, but to make a deeper argument about the foundations, or rather the lack thereof, of human knowledge. He writes how, quote, everything that surrounds us may be viewed as an instance of dialectic. We are aware that everything is finite, instead of being stable and ultimate, is rather changeable and transient. This is exactly what we mean by the dialectic of the finite, by which the finite, as implicitly other than what it is forced beyond its own immediate or natural being to turn suddenly into its opposite, unquote. The conclusion of dialectical reasoning, quote, is the nothingness of all finite existence, unquote. And this amounts to the same viewpoint as what Crowley calls the vision of sorrow, which is also equivalent to the Buddhist notion of shunyata, that all existent beings are devoid of an abiding, eternal metaphysical essence. This is not the end of the story, however. Hegel insists that, quote, in contradistinction to mere skepticism, however, philosophy does not remain content with the purely negative result of dialectic. The skeptic mistakes the true value of his result when he supposes it to be no more than a negation pure and simple, unquote. For negation to be really and fully negative, it must also in some positive sense negate itself. Through the negation of negation, reasoning becomes self-critical and passes into the third stage of the speculative. The fixed, static concepts of common sense become dynamic and mutable, even through explicit awareness of their pragmatic contextuality. Metaphysical thinking becomes historical thinking. Hegel calls this stage the speculative, precisely because it is human activity and not the imposition of an otherworldly beyond that completes our ideas, holding closed the inherent gaps disclosed by skepticism, reaching towards a totality denied by the incomplete quality of natural reality, yet capable of being posited by the human spirit, which in speculative thinking is self-consciously recognized as the true locus of the divine. Therefore, Hegel writes, quote, speculative truth, it may also be noted, means very much the same as what is called mysticism, unquote. Speculative notions comprehend within themselves their own self-negation, and in that comprehension exemplify what Crowley calls the understanding. This is the enlightened perspective that the transient quality of reality is also simultaneously its free creative mutability in accord with human will to power. The vision of sorrow turns out at the very same time to be the basis of the vision of wonder. Along these lines, Crowley writes, quote, the understanding takes full cognizance of all that vast material which the reason was unable to build into any coherent structure. The contradictions have disappeared by absorption. They have been accepted as essential factors in the nature of truth, which, without them, were a mere congeries of facts. It will be clear from all these considerations that there need be no surprise at this primordial paradox, that skepticism, absolute in every dimension, is the sole possible basis for true attainment, unquote. Hegel's philosophy addresses how understanding is to be attained through the practice of jnana yoga, which makes direct use of the intellect to discriminate truth from illusion. Yet how does this relate to the practice of araha yoga, and the training of the mind through the concentration and visualization exercises undertaken by the thelemic magical practitioner. Describing how the understanding relates to the cultivation of samadhi, Crowley writes that, quote, the nature of knowledge, the culmination and stasis of the intellectual faculties, implies a contradiction in terms. Understanding is the resolution of this antinomy. Samadhi, at first onset productive of bewildering ecstasy, ultimates in this understanding. One may say, therefore, that understanding implies a certain samadhic quality of apprehension. The only correct and adequate mode of the attainment of understanding is to shut off and to inhibit the rational mind altogether, thus leaving a tabula rasa upon which the entirely alien faculty, de nova and sui generis, can write its first word, unquote. Crowley describes samadhi as an overpowering ecstasy that sweeps away the subject's presumed sense of identity. Quote, but then, it will surely be said, what is more unintelligent than this supposed intelligence? Than this formless, even delirious ecstasy which sweeps away all shapes of thought? No sane man would deny this premise. But the explanation is that this ecstasy is, so to say, the throe of birth of the new faculty. It is surely natural for an observer to be startled for the moment by the discovery of a new universe. Samadhi must be clarified by sila, by the stern virtue of constraint, and then appears the paradox that the new law of the mind has come not to destroy but to fulfill the old, unquote. Samadhi is the arising of a jouissance exceeding the parameters of one's preconceived sense of socially interpolated identity, and therefore a genuine transcendence of the psychological ego. The writing of the holy guardian angel upon the tabula rasa of the soul is ultimately one's own writing, but the self who writes has shifted into registers of signification beyond their originally pre-given ideological boundaries. From this new perspective, the Ruach, Crowley's rational mind, is then turned back on, as it were, only now in possession of novel intuitions, synthetic and speculative in character, that it would not have been able to generate if left to its native functioning. The Platonic philosopher or Vedic yogi might remark at this point that samadhi names the state of the noetic transcendence of material phenomena, such that the nature of ultimate spiritual reality can be immediately intuited. However, Crowley's philosophical view is more akin to Buddhism. Samadhi for Crowley is not the attainment of self-conscious self-identification with a transcendent unity, but the self-erasure of any such unity through the unification of both the transcendent and subjective poles of experience in the ecstatic excessive jouissance of the self-negating appearance of nothingness. 0 equals 2. Or as Crowley explains, quote, one might say that in dhyana, the yogic trance immediately preceding samadhi, there was still this quality latent, that the one existing was opposed to the many non-existing. In samadhi, the many and the one are united in a union of existence with non-existence, unquote. The understanding signifies the coalescence of a certain kind of truth within the disorderly and self-contradictory domain of knowledge. But precisely what truth has been disclosed? It so happens that the final essay of Crowley's Little Essays Towards Truth is dedicated to the subject promised by its title, and it concludes the book with a striking anthropological inversion of the traditional philosophical identification of truth with objectivity and illusion with subjectivity. It turns out that for Crowley, as with Kierkegaard, subjectivity is truth, meaning that truth is not the disclosure of a human independent transcendent reality, for all such traditional religious concepts have for Crowley the status of pragmatic constructs for the discovery and deployment of the true will. Truth is the truth of the true will, and of the positing of values by the will to power, and it is that which is most inalienably human. Truth is the insistence of the creative psychological drive that liberates the subject from the restrictive, pre-given limitations of their experience. Truth is freely self-mediated and self-constituting human self-production in and through the creative will. Crowley declares, truth is our path, and truth is our goal. There shall come to all a moment of great light, when the path is seen to be itself the goal. And in that hour every one of us shall exclaim, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Then shall ye understand what is truth, for ye shall understand yourselves, and ye are truth. Love is the law, love under will.